Picture this. You're walking through a modern forest, listening to the familiar chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves beneath your feet. But what if I told you that millions of years ago, this same ground was stalked by dragonflies with wingspans wider than a dinner table? What if creatures the size of city buses once crawled through ancient swamps and forests echoed with sounds no human ear has ever heard? Welcome to a journey through time itself, where we'll uncover the most extraordinary beings that ever walked, flew, or swam on our planet. These aren't the dinosaurs you learned about in school. These are the forgotten giants, the bizarre experiments of evolution, the creatures so incredible that they seem like something from another world entirely. For centuries, we've been piecing together fragments of Earth's lost history, and what we've discovered will absolutely blow your mind. We're talking about insects that could snatch birds from the sky, mammals that hunted dinosaurs, and ecosystems so alien they might as well be from another planet. These weren't just bigger versions of animals we know today. They were something completely different, shaped by an Earth that was utterly transformed from the world we inhabit now. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. These creatures didn't just vanish without a trace. They left behind clues hidden in rock formations, trapped in ancient amber, and buried beneath layers of sediment that tell us exactly how they lived, what they ate, and why they disappeared. It's like having a time machine made of stone and fossilized remains. The Earth these creatures called home was nothing like the planet we know today. Imagine an atmosphere so thick with oxygen that a single spark could ignite entire continents. Picture skies that glowed with an eerie sepia-tinted light, and forests where the trees stretched higher than skyscrapers. This was a world where the very air you breathed would be toxic to human lungs. Yet it was paradise for some of the most magnificent creatures ever to exist. What we're about to explore together challenges everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. For decades, scientists believed they understood the basic story of prehistoric life. But recent discoveries have completely rewritten the textbooks. We found evidence of creatures so massive and so perfectly adapted to their environments that they make today's largest animals look like house pets. These weren't just random evolutionary experiments. They were the result of millions of years of perfect adaptation to conditions that no longer exist on our planet. Every fossil we uncover tells us something new about how life finds a way to thrive in even the most extreme circumstances. And trust me, when you see what these environments were like, you'll understand just how extreme they really were. The story begins over 300 million years ago, during a period that scientists call the Carboniferous. This was an era when the very chemistry of our planet's atmosphere was fundamentally different from today. The air contained almost twice as much oxygen as it does now, creating conditions that seem almost impossible to imagine. This wasn't just a minor difference. It was a complete transformation of what it meant to be alive on Earth. In this oxygen-rich world, the rules of biology were completely rewritten. Creatures could grow to sizes that would be impossible today, not because they were genetically different, but because the very air they breathed allowed their bodies to function at scales we can barely comprehend. It's like discovering that gravity used to work differently, or that water once flowed uphill. The landscape of this ancient world was dominated by vast swamps that stretched across entire continents. These weren't the small wetlands we see today. They were massive, steaming jungles that covered areas larger than modern countries. The humidity was so intense that it created its own weather systems, and the plant life grew with an abundance that has never been matched in Earth's history. Walking through these primordial forests would have been like entering an alien world. The trees weren't the familiar oaks and maples we know, but bizarre, scale-covered giants that looked more like enormous ferns than anything we'd recognize today. Some of these ancient plants grew over 100 feet tall, creating canopies so thick that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. But it wasn't just the plants that were different. The very ground beneath your feet would have been unlike anything in the modern world. The soil was rich with organic matter from countless generations of fallen giants, creating a foundation that could support life forms of incredible size and complexity. This was the stage upon which some of the most extraordinary dramas in Earth's history would unfold. The creatures that emerged from this environment were nothing short of spectacular. Flying through the humid air were insects that dwarfed anything alive today. These weren't just slightly larger versions of modern bugs. They were aerial predators that ruled the skies with the same dominance that eagles and hawks show today. Their hunting strategies were so sophisticated that they could track prey across vast distances using compound eyes that could detect movement with incredible precision. On the ground, the situation was equally remarkable. Crawling through the undergrowth were arthropods, relatives of modern centipedes and millipedes that reached lengths that seem almost impossible. These weren't just oversized versions of creatures you might find in your garden. They were apex predators in their own right, equipped with armor plating that could deflect attacks from other massive predators. What makes these creatures even more fascinating is how perfectly they were adapted to their environment. Every aspect of their anatomy was fine-tuned for survival in this oxygen-rich world. Their respiratory systems were engineering marvels that could extract maximum efficiency from the thick atmosphere. Their exoskeletons were constructed with a precision that modern material science is only beginning to understand. The food webs of this ancient world were incredibly complex, with predator-prey relationships that involved creatures of sizes we can barely imagine. The largest flying insects were aerial hunters that could spot potential meals from incredible distances, then swoop down with speeds that would make modern fighter jets jealous. Their prey included other insects that were themselves giants by today's standards, creating an arms race of size and speed that pushed evolution to its absolute limits. But perhaps the most incredible thing about these creatures is how they solved problems that would stump modern engineers. Take flight, for example. Moving a body the size of a hawk through the air requires incredible amounts of energy and sophisticated control systems. These ancient insects developed flight muscles and wing structures that were so efficient they could maintain powered flight for hours at a time, covering distances that would exhaust modern birds. The predatory strategies employed by these creatures were equally impressive. The largest dragonfly relatives weren't just opportunistic hunters. They were calculated predators that could assess the behavior of their prey and adjust their hunting techniques accordingly. They could hover motionlessly above the water surface, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, or engage in high-speed chases through the forest canopy. Their sensory capabilities were beyond anything we see in modern insects. Compound eyes containing thousands of individual lenses gave them nearly 360-degree vision, allowing them to track multiple targets simultaneously while monitoring for potential threats. This visual system was so advanced that it could detect subtle changes in light and shadow that would be invisible to human eyes. The defensive strategies of their prey were equally sophisticated. Many of the herbivorous insects developed camouflage patterns that allowed them to blend seamlessly with the ancient vegetation. Others evolved flight patterns so erratic and unpredictable that even the most skilled aerial predators had difficulty tracking them. Some species developed chemical defenses that could deter attacks from even the largest predators. What's truly remarkable is that we can piece together these behavioral details from fossil evidence that's hundreds of millions of years old. The preservation of these ancient creatures is so detailed that we can see the individual segments of their compound eyes, the microscopic structures of their wing membranes, and even the contents of their last meals. It's like having a snapshot of daily life in a world that vanished before the first dinosaur ever drew breath. The ecosystem that supported these giants was a delicate balance of factors that would be impossible to recreate today. The climate was warm and stable, with temperatures that remained consistent across vast geographical areas. There were no polar ice caps, no seasonal variations that might stress these massive creatures. It was a world of perpetual summer, where growth and reproduction could continue year-round without the interruptions that modern animals face. The plant life that formed the foundation of this ecosystem was equally extraordinary. These weren't just larger versions of modern plants. They were entirely different forms of life that had evolved specialized strategies for capturing and processing the abundant carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Some of these plants grew so rapidly that they could add several feet to their height in a single growing season. The interaction between these giant plants and the massive insects created feedback loops that drove both groups to even greater sizes. As plants grew taller to capture more sunlight, flying insects evolved longer wings and stronger flight muscles to navigate the increasingly complex three-dimensional environment. As insects grew larger and more numerous, plants developed more sophisticated defenses, which in turn drove further evolution in their insect predators. This arms race between predator and prey, between plant and herbivore, created an escalating cycle of size and complexity that pushed the boundaries of what was biologically possible. Every generation saw slight improvements in efficiency, in size, in hunting ability, or in defensive capabilities. Over millions of years, these small changes accumulated into the spectacular creatures we're only now beginning to understand. The fossil record shows us that this wasn't a chaotic free-for-all, but a highly organized ecosystem with clear hierarchies and specialized niches. Different species of giant insects occupied different levels of the forest canopy, different hunting territories, and different feeding strategies. This specialization allowed multiple species of massive predators to coexist in the same environment without driving each other to extinction. But this incredible world wasn't destined to last forever. The very conditions that allowed these creatures to thrive were slowly changing, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The delicate balance that had sustained this ecosystem for millions of years was beginning to shift, and with it, the fate of these magnificent creatures hung in the balance. The story of how this world came to an end is just as fascinating as the story of how it began, involving global climate changes, the evolution of new predators, and shifts in atmospheric chemistry that would reshape life on Earth forever. But that's a tale for our next chapter, where we'll discover how the reign of the giants came to a dramatic close, and what lessons their disappearance holds for understanding our own planet's future. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Picture the Earth as a massive living laboratory where the most incredible evolutionary experiments were taking place simultaneously across every continent. While those giant insects dominated the skies, something equally extraordinary was happening beneath the surface of the ancient swamps and forests. Deep in the murky waters of these primordial wetlands lived creatures that would make today's largest amphibians look like tiny tadpoles. These were the early amphibians, some stretching over 15 feet in length, with skulls alone measuring 3 feet from snout to the back of their massive heads. Their jaws were lined with teeth that could crush through the toughest exoskeletons, making them the undisputed rulers of the aquatic realm. But here's where the story gets really interesting, for these weren't just bigger versions of modern salamanders or frogs. They were something entirely different. Predators so perfectly adapted to their environment that they had developed hunting strategies we're only now beginning to understand through careful analysis of their fossilized remains. The largest of these aquatic giants possessed sensory systems that were absolutely mind-blowing. Along their bodies ran lateral line systems, networks of sensitive cells that could detect the slightest movement in the water from incredible distances. Imagine being able to sense a fish swimming 50 feet away just from the tiny pressure waves it creates. These creatures could track multiple prey items simultaneously while remaining completely motionless, like living underwater radar stations. Their feeding habits were equally spectacular. Unlike modern amphibians that primarily eat small insects and worms, these ancient giants were apex predators that hunted everything from large fish to other amphibians, and even the occasional unlucky giant insect that ventured too close to the water's surface. Their skulls show adaptations for a feeding strategy called suction feeding, where they could create powerful vacuum forces to draw prey directly into their cavernous mouths. The fossil evidence reveals something even more remarkable about these creatures. Many of them had developed what scientists call sit-and-wait predation strategies that were incredibly sophisticated. They would position themselves in strategic locations, near fallen logs, in deep pools, or at the confluence of ancient waterways, and remain perfectly still for hours or even days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. When that moment came, the attack was devastating. These creatures could accelerate from complete stillness to incredible speeds in fractions of a second. Their powerful tails, some measuring over 6 feet in length, could propel them through the water with explosive force. The biomechanics of their attack were so efficient that they could capture prey before their victims even realized they were in danger. But the aquatic realm wasn't the only place where giants ruled. On land, a completely different set of creatures was evolving strategies that would make modern predators seem almost timid by comparison. These were the early reptiles, and they were experimenting with body plans and hunting techniques that had never been tried before in Earth's history. Some of these ancient reptiles developed into what can only be described as living tanks. Their bodies were covered in elaborate armor plating that could deflect attacks from the most powerful predators of their time. But this wasn't just defensive equipment. These armored giants were active hunters that used their protection to engage in combat with creatures that other animals wouldn't dare approach. The engineering behind this natural armor is absolutely fascinating. Each plate was positioned with mathematical precision to provide maximum protection while still allowing for mobility. The overlapping scales could flex and move like chain mail, providing complete coverage without restricting the animal's ability to hunt, feed, or defend itself. Modern military engineers are still studying these designs for inspiration in creating better protective equipment. Other reptiles took a completely different approach to survival in this dangerous world. Instead of armor, they developed speed and agility that would put modern athletes to shame. These creatures had evolved skeletal systems that were optimized for rapid acceleration and precise maneuvering through the complex three-dimensional environment of the ancient forests. Their leg bones show adaptations that are remarkably similar to those found in modern cheetahs and other fast-running mammals. But these reptiles were experimenting with high-speed locomotion millions of years before mammals had even evolved the basic body plan for running. They had independently discovered the same biomechanical principles that would later be refined by entirely different groups of animals. The predator-prey relationships in these ancient ecosystems were incredibly complex, involving multiple layers of hunters and hunted that created food webs more intricate than anything we see in modern environments. A single ecosystem might contain 5 or 6 different apex predators, each specialized for hunting in different environments or targeting different types of prey. The flying giants we discussed earlier were just one component of this system. In the water, massive amphibians controlled the aquatic food webs. On land, armored reptiles and fast-running predators competed for terrestrial prey. And connecting all these environments were creatures that could move between multiple habitats, exploiting resources that were unavailable to more specialized species. This multi-dimensional approach to ecosystem organization allowed for incredible biodiversity. Scientists estimate that some of these ancient communities contained more species per square mile than any modern ecosystem, including tropical rainforests. The sheer variety of body plans, feeding strategies, and ecological niches represented evolutionary experimentation on a scale that has never been matched. What makes this even more remarkable is that all of this was happening without any of the dominant animal groups we're familiar with today. There were no mammals, no birds, no flowering plants, no grass, no modern trees. Every single creature in these ecosystems was working with completely different biological tools and strategies than anything alive today. The plant communities that supported all this animal life were equally extraordinary. These weren't just forests. They were living cathedrals that stretched impossibly high into the oxygen-rich atmosphere. Some of these ancient trees grew to heights that would dwarf modern redwoods, creating canopy systems so complex that they supported entirely separate ecosystems at different elevations. The forest floor was a world unto itself, shrouded in perpetual twilight and carpeted with the fallen remains of countless generations of giants. This layer was home to decomposer organisms that were just as spectacular as the predators living above them. Some of these ancient fungi formed networks that covered hundreds of square miles, breaking down organic matter and recycling nutrients on a scale that modern ecosystems can barely match. The middle canopy was perhaps the most active layer, where the majority of the flying giants spent their time hunting and competing for territory. This was a three-dimensional battlefield where aerial combat took place on a daily basis, with different species of giant insects engaging in dogfights that would make modern fighter pilots jealous. The upper canopy was the domain of the largest flyers, creatures so massive that they needed the highest branches and the strongest air currents to support their incredible size. These giants could soar for miles without flapping their wings, using thermal currents and wind patterns to patrol territories that covered hundreds of square miles. The interconnections between these different layers created feedback systems that drove continued evolution toward larger and more specialized forms. As competition intensified at each level, successful species grew larger, developed more sophisticated hunting techniques, or evolved into unexplored ecological niches. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these ancient ecosystems was their stability. Despite the constant predation pressure and intense competition, these communities persisted for millions of years with remarkably little change. The fossil record shows us ecosystems that maintained their basic structure and dominant species for longer periods than modern ecosystems typically exist. This stability was possible because of the consistent environmental conditions that characterized this period of Earth's history. The climate was not only warm and humid, but it was also incredibly stable. There were no ice ages, no major volcanic eruptions, no asteroid impacts to disrupt the delicate balance that had developed over millions of years of evolution. The atmospheric composition remained consistent for vast periods of time, allowing creatures to become perfectly adapted to very specific conditions without having to worry about rapid environmental changes. This stability created a biological arms race that pushed evolution to its absolute limits, producing creatures that were optimized for their environment to a degree we rarely see in modern species. The chemical composition of the ancient oceans was also dramatically different from today's seas. Higher levels of dissolved minerals and different pH levels created aquatic environments that could support much larger and more diverse communities of marine life. The fossil record from these ancient seas reveals creatures that make modern marine giants look modest by comparison. Some of the marine reptiles from this period reached lengths of over 60 feet, with skulls alone measuring 15 feet from tip to tail. These weren't just larger versions of modern marine animals. They were completely different types of predators that had evolved hunting strategies we can barely imagine. Their sensory capabilities were extraordinary, combining excellent vision with sophisticated chemical detection systems that could track prey across vast distances. Some species developed echolocation abilities similar to modern dolphins, but using frequencies and techniques that were uniquely their own. The diversity of marine ecosystems during this period was staggering. Different regions of the ancient oceans supported completely different communities of giants, each adapted to specific depth ranges, water temperatures, and prey types. The fossil record suggests that some areas of the ocean contained marine food webs with over a dozen different apex predator species, all coexisting in the same general area. This level of predator diversity is almost impossible to achieve in modern marine ecosystems, where typically one or two species dominate each ecological niche. The ancient oceans had somehow found ways to support much more complex predator communities, possibly because of the incredibly abundant prey base that existed during this time period. The prey species themselves were equally remarkable. Ancient fish reached sizes that would make modern tuna look like minnows, and some developed defensive strategies that were incredibly sophisticated. Schooling behaviors, camouflage patterns, and escape tactics all evolved to levels of complexity that rival anything we see in modern marine environments. Some of the most fascinating discoveries have come from preserved stomach contents of these ancient marine predators. Scientists have found evidence of feeding behaviors that involved cooperative hunting between different species, complex food caching strategies, and even what appears to be tool use among some of the more intelligent marine reptiles. The evidence suggests that some of these ancient marine ecosystems were more complex and sophisticated than anything that exists in our modern oceans. The combination of stable environmental conditions, abundant resources, and millions of years of uninterrupted evolution had created biological communities that represent the absolute pinnacle of what's possible in marine environments. As we continue to uncover more fossils from this incredible period, each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding how life on Earth can achieve levels of size, complexity, and sophistication that seem almost impossible by today's standards. These weren't just random evolutionary experiments. They were the result of perfect conditions that allowed life to explore possibilities that may never exist again on our planet. The sheer scale of these discoveries forces us to completely reimagine what we thought we knew about the limits of life on Earth. But here's where our story takes an unexpected turn. Because while these marine and terrestrial giants were reaching unprecedented sizes, something equally extraordinary was happening in the microscopic world that would ultimately determine their fate. Scientists studying ancient sediment cores have uncovered evidence of microbial communities that were unlike anything we see today. These weren't just bacteria and simple organisms. They were complex networks of microorganisms that had evolved to process the unique chemistry of their oxygen-rich world. Some of these microscopic communities formed structures that covered vast areas of the ocean floor, creating biological carpets that could be seen from space if satellites had existed back then. What makes this discovery so significant is that these microbial mats were essentially the foundation upon which the entire ecosystem of giants was built. They processed nutrients, regulated atmospheric chemistry, and created the stable environmental conditions that allowed massive creatures to thrive for millions of years. Without these microscopic engineers working behind the scenes, none of the spectacular giants we've been discussing could have existed. The relationship between these tiny organisms and the massive predators above them created feedback loops that are mind-boggling in their complexity. As the giants grew larger and more numerous, they produced more waste products that fed the microbial communities. As the microbes processed these nutrients more efficiently, they created even more favorable conditions for larger organisms to evolve. This symbiotic relationship between the smallest and largest forms of life demonstrates something profound about how ecosystems function. The most visible and impressive creatures are often completely dependent on organisms so small they're invisible to the naked eye. It's a humbling reminder that even the mightiest predators are part of interconnected webs that extend far beyond what we can easily observe. But the story becomes even more fascinating when we examine how these ancient ecosystems dealt with the challenge of waste management. With creatures of such enormous size producing correspondingly massive amounts of waste, you might expect these environments to become polluted and uninhabitable. Instead, the opposite happened. The ancient world had evolved incredibly efficient recycling systems that could break down and reprocess organic matter faster than modern ecosystems can handle much smaller waste loads. Specialized decomposer organisms had evolved that could process the shells, bones, and organic remains of giants with remarkable speed and efficiency. Some of these decomposers were giants in their own right. Fungal networks spread across hundreds of square miles, breaking down fallen trees that were larger than modern buildings. These fungal systems were so extensive and sophisticated that they essentially functioned as the circulatory system of entire continents, moving nutrients and information across vast distances. The speed at which these systems operated was extraordinary. A giant predator that died in the morning could be completely processed and recycled back into the ecosystem within a matter of days. This rapid turnover of organic matter meant that nutrients were constantly being made available to support new growth, creating a biological economy that was incredibly dynamic and efficient. Modern ecosystems simply can't match this level of efficiency. When large animals die today, it can take months or even years for their remains to be fully processed and recycled. The ancient world had somehow solved problems of scale and efficiency that we're still struggling to understand. This efficiency extended to energy transfer as well. The food webs of the ancient world were remarkably good at capturing and utilizing solar energy. Plants converted sunlight to chemical energy with an efficiency that modern vegetation can't match. Herbivores processed plant matter more completely, extracting more nutrients from each bite. Predators utilized their prey more efficiently, wasting less energy and biomass. The result was an ecosystem that could support much larger populations of much larger organisms than should have been theoretically possible. It was as if the entire biological world had been optimized for maximum efficiency and productivity, creating conditions that allowed life to achieve sizes and complexities that seem almost magical by today's standards. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these ancient ecosystems was their resilience. Despite supporting such enormous creatures in complex food webs, they were incredibly stable and resistant to disruption. Small changes in climate, temporary food shortages, or local disasters that would devastate modern ecosystems were absorbed and compensated for with remarkable ease. This resilience came from the incredible redundancy built into these systems. If one species of giant predator suffered a population decline, multiple other species could expand to fill the vacant ecological niche. If environmental conditions changed in one area, organisms could migrate to more suitable habitats without disrupting the overall ecosystem balance. The genetic diversity within species was also extraordinary. Individual populations of ancient giants contained more genetic variation than entire modern species possess today. This genetic richness provided a buffer against environmental changes and allowed for rapid adaptation to new conditions. Scientists studying ancient DNA fragments have discovered that some species maintained stable population sizes for millions of years while continuously evolving and adapting to subtle environmental changes. This combination of stability and adaptability is something that modern conservation biologists can only dream of achieving. The communication systems used by these ancient giants were equally sophisticated. Large predators needed ways to coordinate their activities across vast territories, and they developed signaling methods that were remarkably complex. Some species used infrasonic calls that could travel for hundreds of miles, allowing individuals to communicate across entire mountain ranges. Others developed visual signaling systems that involved elaborate displays of color and movement. The fossil record preserves evidence of skin patterns and structural features that were clearly designed for long-distance visual communication. Some of these display structures were so large and elaborate that they would have been visible from miles away. Chemical communication was perhaps even more sophisticated. Ancient giants produced and detected chemical signals with a precision that modern animals can barely match. Some species could track individual scent trails across hundreds of miles, following chemical breadcrumbs that were days or even weeks old. These communication networks created social structures that spanned entire continents. Related individuals could maintain contact across vast distances, coordinating breeding activities, sharing information about food sources, and warning each other about potential threats. The result was social organization, on a scale that has never been matched in the modern world. The mating systems of these creatures were equally extraordinary. With individuals spread across such vast territories, finding suitable mates required sophisticated strategies that combined long-distance communication, precise timing, and elaborate courtship behaviors. Some species developed mating aggregations where hundreds of individuals would gather at specific locations during certain times of the year. These gatherings were spectacular events that could be detected from incredible distances through sound, scent, and visual displays that lit up the ancient landscape. The courtship behaviors themselves were incredibly complex, involving displays that could continue for weeks or even months. Males would construct elaborate structures, perform intricate dances, or engage in competitive displays that demonstrated their fitness and genetic quality to potential mates. The energy investment required for these behaviors was enormous, but the payoff justified the cost. Successful reproduction in these ancient ecosystems required individuals to be at the absolute peak of physical condition and behavioral sophistication. Only the most impressive individuals could successfully attract mates and pass their genes to the next generation. This intense selection pressure drove continuous evolution toward larger size, more elaborate displays, and more sophisticated behaviors. Each generation produced individuals that were slightly more impressive than their parents, creating an evolutionary arms race that pushed these species to the absolute limits of what was biologically possible. The parental care systems that evolved in response to these pressures were remarkable. With such enormous investments in reproduction, parents couldn't afford to lose offspring to predation or environmental hazards. Many species developed protective behaviors that were incredibly sophisticated and resource-intensive. Some ancient giants built elaborate nests or dens that provided protection for their young for months or even years. Others developed migration patterns that moved offspring to safer environments during vulnerable periods of development. Still others evolved cooperative breeding systems where multiple adults worked together to protect and raise young. The fossil record provides evidence of parental care behaviors that exceeded anything we see in modern animals. Some species appear to have provided food and protection for their offspring for several years, teaching them hunting techniques, territorial boundaries, and social behaviors that were essential for survival in their complex world. These extended periods of parental investment created opportunities for cultural transmission that were remarkable for their time. Young animals learned not just basic survival skills, but sophisticated techniques that had been refined over many generations. Knowledge about optimal hunting grounds, seasonal migration routes, and social hierarchies was passed down from parents to offspring like a biological library. The accumulation of this cultural knowledge over millions of years created animal societies that possessed collective wisdom and behavioral sophistication that approached what we might consider primitive civilization. Groups of related individuals shared knowledge, coordinated activities, and made collective decisions that benefited the entire community. Some of the most intriguing fossil evidence suggests that certain species developed primitive technologies. Tool use has been documented in several ancient giant species, with individuals using rocks, sticks, and other objects to obtain food, construct shelters, or defend territory. The tools themselves were often modified for specific purposes, showing evidence of planning and foresight that indicates sophisticated cognitive abilities. Some sites contain what appear to be tool caches, where multiple implements were stored for future use, suggesting that these ancient giants could plan for future needs and anticipate upcoming challenges. The social implications of tool use were profound. Individuals who possessed superior tool-making skills had significant advantages in obtaining food and resources, leading to social hierarchies based on technological proficiency, rather than just physical strength or size. These technological innovations spread through populations remarkably quickly, suggesting that these ancient giants possessed sophisticated learning abilities and could rapidly adopt beneficial behaviors developed by other individuals. The speed of cultural evolution in some species appears to have exceeded the rate of genetic evolution, allowing for rapid adaptation to changing conditions. The combination of large brains, long lifespans, extended parental care, and complex social structures created conditions that were ideal for the development of intelligence and culture. Some of these ancient species may have achieved levels of cognitive sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the evolution of modern mammals millions of years later. The archaeological evidence from some sites suggests that certain groups of ancient giants engaged in behaviors that can only be described as ritualistic. Arrangements of bones, stones, and other objects show patterns that appear too complex and organized to be the result of random chance or simple functional needs. These potential ritual sites raise fascinating questions about the inner lives of these ancient creatures. Did they possess concepts of death, spirituality, or aesthetic beauty? Were they capable of abstract thought and symbolic reasoning? The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete, leaving us to wonder about the full extent of their mental capabilities. What we do know is that these ancient ecosystems supported levels of behavioral complexity and social organization that were unprecedented in Earth's history up to that point. The combination of stable environmental conditions, abundant resources, and millions of years of uninterrupted evolution had created biological communities that achieved remarkable levels of sophistication. The legacy of these ancient giants extends far beyond their impressive size and spectacular appearance. They demonstrated evolutionary possibilities that continue to influence how we think about the potential for life to develop complexity, intelligence, and social organization under favorable conditions. Their story also provides crucial insights into the factors that allow ecosystems to support such extraordinary biodiversity and biomass. The lessons learned from studying these ancient communities are helping modern scientists understand how to create more resilient and productive ecosystems in our contemporary world. But perhaps most importantly, the story of these forgotten giants reminds us that our planet has supported forms of life that were far more spectacular and sophisticated than anything alive today. The Earth's biological history includes chapters that read like science fiction, filled with creatures and ecosystems that challenge our assumptions about what's possible in the natural world. As we continue to uncover new fossils and develop better techniques for studying ancient life, each discovery adds new details to this incredible story. Every bone, every trace fossil, every chemical signature preserved in ancient rocks provides another clue about how these remarkable creatures lived, behaved, and interacted with their environment. The technology we're using to study these ancient ecosystems is advancing rapidly, allowing us to extract information from fossils that would have been impossible to obtain just a few years ago. Advanced imaging techniques, chemical analysis, and computer modeling are revealing details about ancient life that bring these creatures back to life in ways that earlier generations of scientists could never have imagined. We're now able to determine not just what these creatures looked like, but how they moved, what they ate, how they communicated, and even what colors they displayed. The ancient world is becoming less mysterious and more vivid with each passing year, as new discoveries fill in the gaps in our understanding of these remarkable ecosystems. But even as we learn more about these ancient giants, new questions continue to emerge. Each answer we find leads to deeper mysteries about the nature of life, evolution, and the conditions that allow biological systems to achieve such extraordinary levels of complexity and sophistication. The story of these forgotten creatures is far from over. In fact, we may be on the verge of discovering even more spectacular examples of ancient life that will further expand our understanding of what's possible in the natural world. The Earth's fossil record still holds countless secrets waiting to be uncovered by future generations of scientists and explorers. What we're discovering about these ancient ecosystems is forcing us to completely rethink our understanding of evolutionary limits. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn that will change everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. While those massive insects ruled the ancient skies and giant amphibians dominated the swamps, the Earth itself was beginning to undergo changes that would reshape the entire planet. The delicate balance that had allowed these creatures to grow to such incredible sizes was starting to shift in ways that would have consequences no living thing could have predicted. The first signs of change weren't immediately obvious. Deep beneath the surface of those vast ancient swamps, something remarkable was happening to the dead plant material that had been accumulating for millions of years, layer upon layer of fallen giants. Trees the size of skyscrapers and ferns as large as modern buildings were being compressed and transformed into what we now know as coal deposits. This process was removing enormous amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, carbon that had been feeding the explosive plant growth that formed the foundation of these incredible ecosystems. As more and more carbon became locked away in underground deposits, the atmospheric chemistry that had made the age of giants possible was slowly beginning to change. But the transformation wasn't happening in isolation. At the same time, a new type of organism was beginning to appear in these ancient forests, something that would prove to be one of the most significant evolutionary innovations in Earth's history. These were the first fungi capable of decomposing wood, and their arrival would trigger a cascade of changes that would reshape life on our planet forever. Before these wood-decomposing fungi evolved, Dead trees would simply accumulate on the forest floor, eventually being buried and compressed into coal. But now, for the first time in Earth's history, there were organisms that could break down this woody material and release its stored carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This might not sound particularly dramatic, but the consequences were absolutely revolutionary. As these fungi spread through the ancient forests, they began to recycle the carbon that had been building up for millions of years. The careful balance between carbon storage and atmospheric composition that had sustained the age of giants was being fundamentally disrupted. The changes weren't immediate. They took place over millions of years, which is virtually instantaneous in geological terms, but represented hundreds of thousands of generations for the creatures living at the time. Slowly but steadily, the oxygen levels that had made giant insects possible began to decline. As oxygen concentrations dropped, the largest flying insects found themselves facing a crisis that their evolutionary history had never prepared them for. Their massive bodies, which had been perfectly adapted to the oxygen-rich atmosphere, suddenly became liabilities in a world where each breath contained less of the vital gas they needed to survive. The respiratory systems that had allowed these creatures to grow to incredible sizes were incredibly efficient, but only under the specific atmospheric conditions that had existed for millions of years. As oxygen levels declined, even small reductions in atmospheric concentration had dramatic effects on their ability to supply their massive flight muscles with the energy they needed. The largest species were affected first. Flying insects with wingspans measured in feet found themselves unable to sustain the powered flight that had made them the undisputed rulers of the ancient skies. Their hunting strategies, which had been refined over millions of years of evolution, became increasingly ineffective as their flight performance declined. But the crisis wasn't limited to the flying giants. The massive ground-dwelling arthropods faced similar challenges. Their enormous bodies required constant supplies of oxygen to fuel their metabolisms. And as atmospheric concentrations declined, they found themselves struggling to obtain enough oxygen to support their basic life functions. The effects cascaded through the entire ecosystem. As the largest predators struggled with declining oxygen levels, their prey species experienced reduced predation pressure. This might sound like good news for the smaller creatures, but ecosystems that had been balanced for millions of years suddenly found themselves thrown into chaos. Species that had evolved to fill very specific ecological niches suddenly found their roles changing. Prey animals that had spent millions of years developing elaborate defenses against giant predators discovered that their biggest threats were disappearing. But this created new competitive pressures as different species began competing for resources that had previously been controlled by the giants. The plant communities that had formed the foundation of these ecosystems were also affected by the changing atmospheric conditions. The high carbon dioxide levels that had driven the explosive plant growth of the Carboniferous period were declining as the new fungi recycled carbon more efficiently. Plants that had grown to incredible sizes found themselves unable to maintain their massive structures in the changing atmospheric conditions. The forest canopies that had stretched impossibly high into the sky began to collapse as the largest trees could no longer support their own weight in the changing atmospheric conditions. This created a domino effect that affected every level of the forest ecosystem, from the giants that lived in the highest branches to the decomposer organisms that recycled nutrients on the forest floor. As the ancient forests began to change, the stable climate that had supported these ecosystems for millions of years also started to shift. The massive plant communities that had helped regulate global temperatures were shrinking, leading to more variable weather patterns and less predictable seasonal cycles. The ocean currents that had remained stable for millions of years began to change as global climate patterns shifted. This affected marine ecosystems that had been perfectly balanced for supporting their own communities of giants. Marine predators that had ruled the ancient seas found themselves facing changing prey distributions and altered ocean chemistry. But perhaps the most significant change was the emergence of entirely new types of predators that were better adapted to the changing world. While the ancient giants struggled with declining oxygen levels and changing atmospheric conditions, smaller, more efficient predators began to evolve that could thrive in the new environment. These new predators weren't just smaller versions of the giants they were replacing. They represented completely different approaches to survival and hunting. Instead of relying on massive size and brute force, they developed strategies based on speed, intelligence, and efficiency. The first flying vertebrates began to appear during this period of transition. These weren't the massive lumbering giants that had dominated the ancient skies, but smaller, more agile creatures that could maneuver through the changing forest environments with unprecedented precision. These early flying vertebrates possessed several key advantages over the declining insect giants. Their respiratory systems were based on completely different principles that were much more efficient at extracting oxygen from the atmosphere. Even as oxygen levels declined, these new predators could maintain high levels of activity and performance. Their nervous systems were also more sophisticated, allowing for complex behaviors and hunting strategies that the giant insects couldn't match. While the ancient giants had relied primarily on size and strength, these new predators could use intelligence and planning to outmaneuver prey and competitors. The skeletal systems of these flying vertebrates were fundamentally different from the exoskeletons of the giant insects. Instead of external armor that became increasingly difficult to support as size increased, they had internal skeletons that could support larger body sizes more efficiently while remaining lightweight enough for flight. Their wing structures were also more efficient than those of the giant insects. Instead of rigid wings that required massive flight muscles to operate, they had flexible wing membranes that could be adjusted for different flight conditions. This made them much more maneuverable and energy efficient than their insect predecessors. As these new flying predators established themselves in the ancient ecosystems, they began to compete directly with the declining giant insects for food resources and territory. The competition wasn't even. The newcomers had significant advantages in the changing environmental conditions. The hunting strategies employed by these early flying vertebrates were remarkably sophisticated. Instead of the straightforward pursuit tactics used by most giant insects, they developed complex behavioral patterns that involved cooperation, planning, and the use of environmental features to their advantage. Some species learned to hunt in coordinated groups, using communication and teamwork to take down prey much larger than themselves. Others developed ambush tactics that allowed them to surprise prey from unexpected angles or locations. Still others became specialists at exploiting specific environmental conditions or prey behaviors. The sensory capabilities of these new predators were also superior to those of the giant insects. While the ancient giants had possessed impressive compound eyes and other sensory organs, the flying vertebrates had evolved more sophisticated nervous systems that could process sensory information more effectively. Their hearing was particularly advanced, allowing them to detect and locate prey through sound in ways that the giant insects couldn't match. This gave them significant advantages when hunting in the dense forest environments that were becoming increasingly common as the ancient open swamps began to disappear. The declining giant insects found themselves facing competition they were poorly equipped to handle. Their evolutionary history had prepared them for a world of abundant oxygen and stable environmental conditions, but they had no experience dealing with more intelligent, flexible predators that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. The fossil record from this period shows a dramatic decline in the diversity and size of giant insects, accompanied by a corresponding increase in the variety and sophistication of flying vertebrates. This wasn't just a simple replacement of one group by another. It was a fundamental shift in how aerial ecosystems were organized and functioned. The transition wasn't uniform across all environments. In some areas, giant insects managed to persist for much longer than in others, particularly in regions where local environmental conditions remained more similar to the ancient norm. But even in these refugia, the writing was on the wall. The new flying vertebrates were more than just competitors. They were representatives of an entirely different approach to life that was better suited to the changing world. They were smaller, more efficient, more intelligent, and more adaptable than the giants they were replacing. As the transformation continued, the ancient ecosystems that had supported the age of giants began to fragment and disappear. The vast swamp forests that had covered entire continents were replaced by more diverse and dynamic environments that favored smaller, more adaptable organisms. The stable climate that had allowed the same species to persist unchanged for millions of years gave way to more variable conditions that rewarded flexibility and adaptability over size and specialization. The New World was one where survival depended on the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions rather than perfect adaptation to stable environments. The marine ecosystems underwent similar transformations. The giant marine reptiles that had ruled the ancient seas found themselves facing new challenges as ocean chemistry changed and prey distributions shifted. Smaller, more efficient marine predators began to appear that could exploit resources the giants couldn't access. The coastal environments where many of the giant amphibians had thrived began to change as sea levels fluctuated and climate patterns shifted. The predictable seasonal cycles that had supported their complex life cycles became increasingly irregular, making reproduction and survival more difficult. On land, the forest floor communities that had been dominated by giant arthropods experienced dramatic reorganization. The massive decomposer organisms that had processed the remains of fallen giants found themselves with less material to work with as the forests became smaller and less productive. The soil communities that had supported the incredible plant growth of the ancient world began to change as nutrient cycling patterns shifted. The elaborate fungal networks that had connected entire forest ecosystems started to fragment as the forests themselves became smaller and more scattered. But perhaps the most significant change was the emergence of new types of plant communities that were better adapted to the changing atmospheric and climatic conditions. These weren't just smaller versions of the ancient giants. They represented completely different strategies for capturing and using solar energy. The new plant communities were more diverse and specialized than their predecessors. Instead of a few species of massive trees dominating entire landscapes, ecosystems began to support dozens or even hundreds of different plant species, each adapted to specific environmental conditions and ecological niches. This increased plant diversity created opportunities for new types of herbivorous animals that could specialize in feeding on particular plant species or plant parts. The simple food webs of the ancient world, where a few species of giant herbivores fed on a few species of giant plants, gave way to much more complex networks of interactions. The new herbivores were generally smaller than their ancient predecessors, but they were also more diverse and specialized. Some developed into browsers that fed on leaves and shoots. Others became grazers that consumed ground-level vegetation, and still others evolved into seed eaters or fruit specialists. This diversification of herbivores created opportunities for new types of predators that could specialize in hunting particular types of prey. The ancient world had been dominated by a few species of massive generalist predators, but the changing world favored smaller, more specialized hunters. The predator-prey relationships that evolved during this transition period were much more complex than those of the ancient world. Instead of simple linear food chains, ecosystems developed intricate webs of interactions where the loss of any single species could have cascading effects throughout the entire community. The new ecosystems were more dynamic and less stable than their ancient predecessors, but they were also more resilient in some ways. The diversity of species and complexity of interactions meant that communities could often compensate for the loss of individual species by reorganizing their structure and function. This resilience would prove to be crucial as the Earth continued to change. The transition from the age of giants to the more diverse and dynamic ecosystems that followed was just the beginning of a series of transformations that would continue to reshape life on our planet. The lessons from this great transition are profound and continue to influence how we understand ecological change and species survival. The ancient giants weren't victims of a single catastrophic event. They were casualties of gradual environmental changes that exceeded their ability to adapt. Their story demonstrates that even the most successful organisms can become vulnerable when environmental conditions change faster than evolution can respond. Size and strength, which had been advantages for millions of years, became liabilities when atmospheric and climatic conditions shifted. The survival strategies that proved most effective during this transition, flexibility, efficiency, intelligence, and adaptability, would become the dominant themes in the evolution of life on Earth. The new world that emerged from the collapse of the ancient ecosystems was one where success depended on the ability to change rather than the ability to remain unchanged. The flying vertebrates that replaced the giant insects would go on to diversify into the birds we know today. But their evolutionary success began with their ability to thrive in conditions that proved fatal to their massive predecessors. Their story is a testament to the power of evolutionary innovation and adaptation. The marine reptiles that survived the transition would eventually give rise to entirely new lineages of aquatic predators, each adapted to the changing ocean conditions in different ways. Some became the ancestors of modern marine reptiles, while others evolved into forms that have no modern equivalents. The plant communities that emerged from the transformation of the ancient forest would eventually include the flowering plants that dominate modern terrestrial ecosystems. But their success story began with their ability to thrive in the more variable and competitive conditions that replaced the stable ancient world. The decomposer organisms that survived the collapse of the ancient ecosystems evolved into the complex soil communities that support modern agriculture and natural ecosystems. Their ability to adapt to changing nutrient cycles and forest composition was crucial to the development of the diverse ecosystems we see today. Even the fungal networks that help modern forests communicate and share resources can trace their origins back to the organisms that first learned to decompose wood and recycle the carbon locked away in the ancient coal forests. Their evolutionary innovation triggered the transformation that ended the age of giants. The story of this great transition continues to unfold as new fossil discoveries provide additional details about how the change occurred and which factors were most important in determining which species survived and which perished. Each new find adds another piece to the puzzle of understanding one of the most significant transformations in the history of life on Earth. The techniques we're using to study this transition are revealing details about ancient ecosystems that would have been impossible to detect just a few decades ago. Chemical analysis of ancient soils, sophisticated computer modeling of atmospheric changes, and detailed studies of fossil preservation are providing unprecedented insights into how these changes occurred. We're now able to track the decline of giant insect populations with remarkable precision, measuring changes in body size, population distribution, and species diversity across different geographical regions and time periods. The patterns that emerge tell a story of gradual decline, punctuated by periods of more rapid change. The replacement of giant insects by flying vertebrates can now be documented in detail, showing how the transition occurred at different rates in different environments and how local conditions influenced which species survived longest. Some areas served as refugia, where ancient species persisted long after they had disappeared from other regions. The changes in plant communities during this period are particularly well documented, thanks to the excellent preservation of plant fossils in coal deposits and other sedimentary formations. We can see exactly how forest composition changed as atmospheric conditions shifted and new types of decomposer organisms evolved. The marine fossil record from this period is equally revealing, showing how ocean ecosystems reorganized as climate patterns changed and new types of predators evolved. The transition from giant marine reptiles to smaller, more diverse marine communities paralleled the changes occurring on land. But perhaps the most exciting discoveries are those that reveal the behavioral and ecological sophistication of the creatures involved in this transition. Evidence of complex social behaviors, advanced communication systems, and sophisticated predator-prey relationships is helping us understand that this wasn't just a simple replacement of large animals with small ones. The ancient giants possessed levels of intelligence and behavioral complexity that we're only now beginning to appreciate. Their decline wasn't due to any inherent inferiority, but rather to their specialized adaptations becoming mismatched with rapidly changing environmental conditions. The new species that replaced them weren't necessarily better in any absolute sense. They were simply better adapted to the new conditions that emerged as the ancient world transformed. Their success was due to their flexibility and adaptability, rather than any superior design or capability. This understanding has profound implications for how we think about modern conservation and environmental change. The species that are most successful today may not be the ones best equipped to handle future environmental changes, just as the ancient giants were vulnerable despite their millions of years of success. The story of the Great Transition also demonstrates the importance of understanding ecosystems as integrated wholes rather than collections of individual species. The decline of the giants wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a complete reorganization of how life on Earth was structured and organized. The new ecosystems that emerged from this transition were fundamentally different from their predecessors, not just in the size of their component species, but in how those species interacted with each other and their environment. The principles that govern ecological relationships were completely transformed. These changes set the stage for all subsequent evolution on our planet. The basic patterns of predator-prey relationships, competitive interactions, and ecological organization that we see in modern ecosystems can be traced back to innovations that first appeared during this great transition. The legacy of the ancient giants lives on in the genetic heritage of their descendants and in the ecological principles that govern modern ecosystems. While the massive creatures themselves are long extinct, the evolutionary innovations they represented continue to influence life on Earth today. Understanding their story helps us appreciate both the incredible diversity that life has achieved and the fragility of even the most successful biological systems. The ancient world was a testament to the creative power of evolution, but its transformation reminds us that nothing in nature is permanent as we face our own period of rapid environmental change. The lessons learned from studying the Great Transition become increasingly relevant. The factors that determined which species survived and which perished during that ancient transformation may provide crucial insights for understanding how modern ecosystems will respond to contemporary challenges. The story of the forgotten giants and their ultimate fate is far from just an academic exercise in paleontology. It's a window into the fundamental processes that shape life on our planet and determine which forms of life can persist through periods of environmental change. But the tale of transformation and adaptation doesn't end with the decline of the ancient giants. As the old world crumbled and new ecosystems emerged, evolution was already experimenting with innovations that would prove even more revolutionary than anything that had come before. The stage was being set for the emergence of creatures that would not only survive the changing world, but would go on to develop capabilities that would make even the ancient giants seem primitive by comparison. The transformation wasn't just about the giants disappearing. It was about life itself, discovering entirely new ways to exist. While the massive insects struggled with declining oxygen levels and the ancient forests collapsed around them, something extraordinary was happening in the shadows of this dying world. Evolution was conducting experiments that would redefine what it meant to be alive on Earth. Deep in the undergrowth of the changing forests, small creatures were making discoveries that would echo through millions of years. These weren't the spectacular giants that had dominated the headlines of prehistoric life. They were modest, unassuming animals that most observers would have overlooked entirely. But within their bodies, revolutionary changes were taking place that would prove far more significant than any increase in size. The most profound of these innovations was happening inside their skulls. While the ancient giants had possessed impressive sensory capabilities and could execute complex hunting behaviors, their nervous systems were fundamentally limited by their basic architecture. Their brains, such as they were, processed information in relatively simple ways that worked perfectly for their stable world, but offered little flexibility for adaptation. The new creatures emerging from this period of transition were experimenting with completely different approaches to processing information and making decisions. Instead of relying on hardwired responses to environmental stimuli, they were developing the ability to learn, remember, and modify their behavior based on experience. This might sound unremarkable to us, but it represented a cognitive revolution that was every bit as significant as the physical transformations we've been discussing. These early experiments in intelligence weren't immediately obvious from the outside. The creatures developing these capabilities were often smaller and less physically impressive than their predecessors. But what they lacked in size, they made up for in mental sophistication that would have been incomprehensible to the ancient giants. Consider what it means for an animal to truly learn from experience. The giant insects had been masters of their environment, but their responses to situations were largely predetermined by millions of years of evolution. When they encountered prey, predators, or environmental challenges, they executed behaviors that had been refined over countless generations, but couldn't be modified within a single lifetime. The new creatures were different. They could encounter a situation, assess the outcome of their response, and adjust their behavior accordingly. This ability to learn and adapt within a single lifetime gave them enormous advantages in a world that was changing faster than evolution could keep pace with through genetic adaptation alone. But the implications went far beyond simple behavioral flexibility. These early experiments in learning and memory were laying the groundwork for something that had never existed before in Earth's history: the possibility of cultural transmission. Information and techniques discovered by one individual could be passed to others through observation and imitation, rather than through genetic inheritance. The fossil record from this period provides tantalizing hints about the emergence of these capabilities. We find evidence of tool use that shows clear progression and refinement over time within individual populations. Unlike the static tool traditions of earlier periods, these show signs of innovation and improvement that suggest active learning and cultural development. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from sites where we can track the same population of animals over multiple generations. The tools and techniques they used show clear patterns of refinement and sophistication that couldn't have resulted from genetic evolution alone. Knowledge was being accumulated and passed down through non-genetic means. The social implications of these developments were staggering. Animals that could learn from each other and share information had enormous advantages over those that relied solely on instinctive behaviors. They could adapt to new situations more quickly, exploit resources more efficiently, and respond to threats more effectively. But perhaps most importantly, they could begin to modify their environment rather than simply adapting to it. While the ancient giants had been perfectly suited to their world, they were essentially passive participants in their ecosystems. The new creatures were beginning to actively shape their surroundings to better suit their needs. The earliest examples of environmental modification were simple but significant. These animals began creating structures that provided protection from predators, stored food for later consumption, or created more favorable conditions for raising offspring. These weren't the elaborate constructions we associate with modern animals, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between organisms and their environment. As these capabilities developed, they created feedback loops that accelerated further innovation. Animals that could modify their environment created new ecological niches that could support larger populations and more complex social structures. Larger populations provided more opportunities for learning and cultural transmission, which led to more sophisticated environmental modifications. The communities that emerged from these developments were unlike anything that had existed before. Instead of the relatively simple social structures of the ancient giants, these new creatures were experimenting with complex hierarchies, cooperative behaviors, and specialized roles that required sophisticated communication and coordination. The communication systems they developed were far more advanced than the long-distance signaling used by the ancient giants. Instead of simple signals that conveyed basic information about location or threat status, these new creatures were developing the ability to share complex information about techniques, resources, and environmental conditions. Some species developed vocal communication systems that included dozens of distinct calls, each conveying specific information about different aspects of their environment or social relationships. Others evolved elaborate visual displays that could communicate complex concepts through combinations of colors, movements, and postures. But the most revolutionary development was the emergence of what can only be described as primitive language. Some species began using combinations of signals to create new meanings, allowing them to communicate concepts that had never been expressed before. This combinatorial communication was a crucial step toward the kind of flexible, creative communication that would eventually characterize the most intelligent species on our planet. The cognitive demands of these communication systems drove rapid evolution in brain size and complexity. The neural hardware required to produce, process, and respond to complex signals was far more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. Brain-to-body ratios began increasing dramatically in species that relied heavily on social communication and learning. These neurological developments had cascading effects on every aspect of these animals' lives. Enhanced memory capabilities allowed them to remember the locations of resources across vast territories and complex seasonal cycles. Improved pattern recognition helped them identify subtle environmental cues that predicted weather changes, predator movements, or food availability. The ability to plan for future events was perhaps the most significant cognitive advancement. While the ancient giants had lived primarily in the present, responding to immediate stimuli with predetermined behaviors, these new creatures could anticipate future needs and take actions in the present to address challenges that hadn't yet materialized. This planning ability manifested in behaviors that were startlingly sophisticated. Animals began storing food in multiple locations to guard against theft or spoilage. They modified their territories to create better defensive positions or more efficient travel routes. Some species even began seasonal migrations to locations where conditions would be more favorable months in the future. The technological innovations that emerged from these cognitive developments were equally impressive. Tool use evolved from simple applications of found objects to the deliberate modification of materials for specific purposes. Animals began shaping stones, sticks, and other materials to create implements that were more effective than anything available in nature. The progression of tool complexity over time shows clear evidence of cumulative cultural evolution. Each generation built upon the innovations of their predecessors, gradually developing more sophisticated techniques and more effective implements. This technological tradition could persist and develop even when environmental conditions changed, providing stability in an increasingly unpredictable world. Some of the most remarkable innovations involved the creation of composite tools that combined multiple materials or components. These required not only the ability to envision the final product, but also the planning and coordination necessary to gather and prepare multiple components before assembly. The cognitive demands of such projects were extraordinary for their time. The social structures necessary to support these technological traditions were equally complex. Knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted across generations, which required stable social relationships and sophisticated teaching behaviors. Elder individuals who possessed the most knowledge became valuable resources that communities protected and supported. The emergence of specialized roles within communities created opportunities for even greater innovation. Instead of every individual needing to master all necessary skills, communities could support specialists who focused on particular technologies or techniques. This specialization allowed for much deeper expertise and more rapid innovation than would have been possible if every individual remained a generalist. The trading relationships that developed between different communities further accelerated technological and cultural development. Groups that had developed particular innovations could exchange them for different technologies developed by other communities. This cross-pollination of ideas created a kind of technological evolution that operated on a much faster time scale than genetic evolution. The implications of these developments extended far beyond the individual species involved. The emergence of learning, culture, and technology was beginning to decouple evolutionary success from purely genetic factors. Species that could adapt behaviorally and culturally could survive environmental changes that would have been fatal to purely genetically adapted organisms. This represented a fundamental shift in how evolution operated on our planet. While genetic evolution continued to be important, cultural evolution was becoming an increasingly significant factor in determining which species thrived and which perished. The most successful organisms were those that could combine genetic adaptations with cultural innovations. The pace of change was accelerating dramatically. While genetic evolution typically required thousands of generations to produce significant changes, cultural evolution could produce major innovations within a single generation. This acceleration meant that the gap between culturally sophisticated species and those that relied purely on genetic adaptations was growing rapidly. The environmental modifications produced by these culturally sophisticated species were beginning to have ecosystem-wide effects. Their activities were creating new habitats, altering resource distributions, and changing the selective pressures acting on other species. They were becoming ecological engineers on a scale that had never been seen before. Some of these modifications were beneficial to other species, creating opportunities for organisms that could exploit the new niches being created. Others were disruptive, forcing species to adapt to changing conditions or face local extinction. The net effect was an acceleration in the rate of ecological change that matched the acceleration in cultural evolution. The most successful of these culturally sophisticated species were beginning to spread into new environments and geographical regions. Their behavioral flexibility allowed them to adapt to conditions that would have been unsuitable for their genetically specialized predecessors. This geographical expansion further accelerated cultural exchange and innovation. As these species encountered new environments, they faced novel challenges that required creative solutions. The innovations developed in response to these challenges often proved useful in other contexts, leading to a rapid accumulation of generally applicable techniques and technologies. The fossil record from this period shows evidence of increasingly rapid species turnover in many ecosystems. The accelerated pace of cultural and technological change was creating environmental conditions that changed faster than many species could adapt through purely genetic means. This wasn't necessarily harmful to biodiversity overall, as new species evolved to fill emerging niches, but it represented a fundamental change in the dynamics of evolution. The most adaptable species were those that combined moderate genetic specialization with high cultural flexibility. They were genetically equipped with the basic tools necessary for survival in their environment, but culturally capable of modifying their behavior to exploit new opportunities or respond to new challenges. The nervous systems of these species showed clear evidence of the cognitive demands imposed by their complex lifestyles. Brain regions associated with learning, memory, and social processing were expanding dramatically relative to other brain areas. The energetic costs of maintaining these large, complex brains were substantial, but the behavioral advantages they conferred more than compensated for the investment. The social behaviors necessary to support cultural transmission were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Teaching behaviors evolved that went far beyond simple demonstration to include active correction of student errors and progressive introduction of increasingly complex techniques. These teaching relationships often persisted for years, creating strong social bonds that had benefits beyond simple knowledge transfer. The emotional and psychological complexity of these species was also increasing. The social relationships necessary for cultural transmission required abilities to recognize individuals, remember past interactions, and predict future behaviors. These capabilities were supported by emotional systems that were far more nuanced than anything seen in earlier species. Evidence of play behavior becomes increasingly common in the fossil record during this period. Play served crucial functions in developing the motor skills, social relationships, and cognitive abilities necessary for success in culturally complex societies. The time and energy invested in play represented a significant commitment to behavioral development that had no immediate survival value but was crucial for long-term success. The parent-offspring relationships in these species were extended far beyond the simple provision of food and protection seen in earlier animals. Parents became active teachers who invested enormous amounts of time and energy in training their offspring in the complex skills necessary for survival in their sophisticated societies. This extended parental investment had profound effects on population dynamics and social structure. Reproductive success became dependent not just on the ability to produce offspring, but on the ability to successfully educate them in increasingly complex cultural traditions. This created strong selective pressure for enhanced teaching abilities and extended lifespans. The communities that emerged from these developments were beginning to show signs of what could only be called primitive civilization. They had territories with defined boundaries, social hierarchies based on knowledge and skill rather than just physical dominance, and collective decision-making processes for addressing community-wide challenges. Some of the most advanced communities developed what appear to be primitive forms of governance, with recognized leaders who coordinated group activities and resolved conflicts between individuals. These leadership roles were often based on expertise and experience rather than simple physical dominance, representing a sophisticated understanding of the qualities necessary for effective group coordination. The archaeological evidence from some sites suggests that these communities engaged in activities that served no obvious survival function, but may have had social or aesthetic purposes. Arrangements of objects that appear too complex and organized to be functional suggest that these animals possessed concepts of beauty, ceremony, or social meaning that went beyond immediate survival needs. The implications of these developments were staggering. For the first time in Earth's history, organisms were beginning to transcend the limitations imposed by their genetic heritage through cultural innovation and social cooperation. They were creating ways of life that were more complex and sophisticated than anything that could have been achieved through genetic evolution alone. The technologies they developed were beginning to have effects that extended far beyond their immediate users. Tools and techniques that improved hunting efficiency were changing predator-prey dynamics throughout their ecosystems. Construction activities were modifying habitats in ways that affected numerous other species. Cultural traditions were creating behavioral patterns that persisted across multiple generations and geographical regions. But perhaps most significantly, these species were beginning to develop the capacity for abstract thought and symbolic reasoning. Evidence of symbolic behavior, the use of objects or actions to represent concepts rather than immediate physical realities, appears in the archaeological record with increasing frequency during this period. This capacity for symbolic thought was crucial for the development of more sophisticated communication systems, more complex technologies, and more nuanced social relationships. It represented a fundamental shift in how these animals perceived and interacted with their world, moving beyond immediate sensory experiences to conceptual understanding of abstract relationships and principles. The emergence of symbolic thought also opened up possibilities for cultural innovations that had no direct connection to immediate survival needs. These animals began creating objects and engaging in behaviors that served social, aesthetic, or ceremonial functions rather than purely practical purposes. This represented the beginning of what we might recognize as art, religion, or philosophy. The cumulative effect of all these developments was the emergence of species whose capabilities far exceeded anything that had existed before in Earth's history. They possessed intelligence, culture, technology, and social organization that approached levels that wouldn't be seen again until the evolution of modern humans millions of years later. Yet, these remarkable creatures remain largely unknown to the general public. They lived and thrived during periods of Earth's history that are overshadowed by the more spectacular dinosaurs and other well-known prehistoric animals. Their achievements have been overlooked because they were less visually dramatic than the size and power of the ancient giants. But their legacy extends far beyond their own time period. The cognitive and cultural innovations they developed provided the foundation for all subsequent evolution of intelligence on our planet. Every species that has since developed complex social behaviors, technological capabilities, or cultural traditions has built upon innovations that first appeared during this crucial period of Earth's history. The study of these ancient innovators is revolutionizing our understanding of how intelligence and culture evolve. We're discovering that the cognitive capabilities we consider uniquely human actually have much deeper evolutionary roots than previously suspected. The basic building blocks of complex thought and social organization were being experimented with by species that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. Modern techniques for studying ancient behavior are revealing details about these species that would have been impossible to detect just a few decades ago. Chemical analysis of fossilized brain tissue, computer modeling of social networks, and detailed studies of tool assemblages are providing unprecedented insights into the daily lives and cognitive capabilities of these ancient innovators. We are now able to track the development of specific technologies across multiple generations and geographical regions, showing how innovation spread through populations and were modified for local conditions. The patterns that emerge reveal sophisticated systems of cultural transmission that rival anything seen in modern animal societies. The social structures of these ancient communities are being reconstructed through analysis of living sites, burial practices, and artifact distributions. The evidence reveals complex hierarchies, specialized roles, and cooperative behaviors that required levels of social coordination previously thought to be impossible for prehistoric animals. Perhaps most remarkably, we're beginning to understand the emotional and psychological lives of these ancient creatures. Evidence of grief behaviors, play activities, and aesthetic preferences reveals inner lives that were far richer and more complex than anyone had imagined possible for animals that lived so long ago. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond paleontology and archaeology. They're forcing us to reconsider fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and culture. If such sophisticated cognitive capabilities could evolve multiple times in Earth's history, what does that tell us about the likelihood of intelligence evolving elsewhere in the universe? The story of these ancient innovators also provides crucial insights into the factors that promote or inhibit the evolution of intelligence and culture. By understanding the environmental and social conditions that allowed these remarkable capabilities to develop, we may be better able to predict and understand similar developments in other contexts. But perhaps most importantly, the study of these forgotten pioneers reminds us that intelligence and culture are not recent innovations in Earth's history. They represent fundamental strategies for survival that have been tested and refined over hundreds of millions of years. The cognitive revolution that produced modern human civilization was built upon foundations that were laid by creatures whose names we'll never know, but whose innovations continue to influence life on our planet today. The next chapter of our story takes us even deeper into this cognitive revolution as we explore how these early experiments in intelligence and culture set the stage for even more extraordinary developments. The foundation had been laid for creatures that would not only survive the changing world, but would begin to actively reshape it according to their own designs and desires. The ancestors of birds first appeared during this remarkable period of cognitive evolution, emerging from the same environmental pressures that were reshaping life across the planet. But these weren't the familiar feathered creatures we know today. They were something far stranger and more experimental, representing evolution's bold attempts to solve the problem of flight in an entirely new way. Picture creatures that looked like nothing alive today, with elongated arms covered in primitive feathers that served purposes we're only beginning to understand. These early proto-birds weren't just developing the ability to fly. They were pioneering completely new ways of thinking about movement, space, and survival that would revolutionize life on Earth. The fossil evidence reveals that these creatures were conducting their own experiments in intelligence and problem solving. Their brain cases showed dramatic expansion in regions associated with spatial processing and motor coordination, capabilities that were essential for navigating the three-dimensional world of flight. But they were also developing cognitive abilities that went far beyond simple navigation. These early flyers possessed visual processing systems that were absolutely extraordinary. Their eyes could track multiple moving objects simultaneously while maintaining perfect spatial awareness of their own position relative to complex environmental features. This wasn't just improved eyesight. It was a completely new way of perceiving and interacting with the world that required unprecedented levels of neural sophistication. The hunting strategies they developed were equally revolutionary. Instead of the relatively straightforward pursuit tactics used by the giant insects they were replacing, these proto-birds were experimenting with complex aerial maneuvers that required split-second decision-making and precise motor control. They could change direction instantly, accelerate and decelerate with incredible precision, and execute attack patterns that were virtually impossible for their prey to predict or evade. But perhaps most remarkably, they were beginning to use their intelligence to modify their flight capabilities in real time. Unlike the fixed wing structures of insects, these creatures had flexible feathers that could be adjusted for different flight conditions and purposes. The cognitive demands of controlling these adjustable flight surfaces were enormous, requiring constant monitoring and adjustment of dozens of different variables simultaneously. The social behaviors of these early flyers were equally sophisticated. They developed complex communication systems that allowed them to coordinate their activities while in flight, sharing information about prey locations, weather conditions, and territorial boundaries through intricate combinations of calls, visual displays, and flight patterns. Some species began hunting cooperatively, using tactics that required remarkable levels of planning and coordination. They would position themselves at strategic locations around their prey, communicate through subtle signals to coordinate their attacks, and execute synchronized maneuvers that left their victims with no escape routes. This kind of cooperative hunting required cognitive abilities that approached those of modern dolphins or primates. The nesting behaviors of these creatures were equally impressive. They didn't just build simple structures for protecting their eggs. They created elaborate constructions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of engineering principles, weather patterns, and predator behavior. Some nests were positioned to take advantage of specific wind patterns that would help with takeoff and landing. Others incorporated materials that provided camouflage or defense against particular types of threats. The parent-offspring relationships in these species were extended far beyond what we see in most modern birds. Young proto-birds required months or even years of intensive training to master the complex skills necessary for successful flight and hunting. This extended learning period created opportunities for cultural transmission that were unprecedented in flying animals. Different populations of the same species began developing distinct flight techniques and hunting strategies that were passed down through generations. These cultural traditions became so sophisticated that populations separated by relatively small geographical distances developed completely different approaches to solving the same basic survival challenges. The technological innovations of these early flyers were equally remarkable. They began using tools not just for ground-based activities, but as part of their aerial behaviors. Some species learned to drop objects on prey from great heights, using gravity and precision targeting to stun or kill animals that would have been impossible to capture through direct attack. Others developed techniques for using environmental features as tools. They would drive prey toward natural barriers like cliff faces or dense vegetation, then coordinate their attacks to take advantage of the restricted escape routes. This kind of environmental manipulation required cognitive abilities that were unprecedented in flying animals. The territorial behaviors of these creatures were incredibly complex. Instead of simple boundaries marked by scent or sound, they established three-dimensional territories that extended through multiple layers of airspace. Different species claimed rights to specific altitude ranges, flight corridors, and seasonal migration routes through systems of negotiation and enforcement that required sophisticated social intelligence. The migration patterns they developed were marvels of navigation and planning. These weren't simple movements between seasonal feeding areas. They were complex journeys that involved precise timing, route optimization, and coordination between multiple populations. Some species developed migration strategies that took advantage of seasonal wind patterns, food availability cycles, and predator movements across vast geographical regions. The sensory capabilities that supported these behaviors were absolutely extraordinary. These proto-birds could detect magnetic fields for navigation, sense minute changes in air pressure that predicted weather patterns, and perceive polarized light patterns that were invisible to other animals. The integration of all these sensory inputs required neural processing power that was unprecedented in Earth's history. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of what can only be described as aerial culture. Different populations developed distinct flight styles, hunting techniques, and social behaviors that were maintained across multiple generations through social learning rather than genetic inheritance. These cultural traditions became so elaborate that they began to influence the physical evolution of the species themselves. Groups that specialized in particular types of flight developed anatomical features that supported their cultural practices. Those that focused on high-speed pursuit evolved streamlined body shapes and powerful flight muscles. Communities that specialized in precision maneuvering developed enhanced neural control systems and more flexible wing structures. This feedback between cultural practices and physical evolution created a rapid acceleration in the development of flight capabilities. Instead of waiting for random genetic mutations to improve flight performance, these species could develop better techniques culturally, then evolve the physical features necessary to execute those techniques more effectively. The competitive pressures created by these cultural innovations were intense. Communities that failed to keep pace with technological and behavioral developments found themselves at severe disadvantages in competition for resources and territory. This created powerful incentives for continuous innovation and cultural evolution. The result was an explosion of diversity in flight techniques, hunting strategies, and social behaviors that far exceeded anything we see in modern flying animals. The skies of this ancient world were filled with creatures experimenting with approaches to flight that were limited only by the laws of physics and the constraints of their anatomy. Some species developed hovering abilities that allowed them to remain motionless in the air while scanning for prey or monitoring their territories. Others specialized in long-distance soaring, using thermal currents and wind patterns to travel hundreds of miles with minimal energy expenditure. Still others became masters of high-speed maneuvering, capable of executing aerial acrobatics that would challenge modern fighter jets. The diversity of hunting strategies was equally impressive. Some proto-birds became specialists at fishing, developing techniques for diving into water and capturing aquatic prey with remarkable precision. Others focused on hunting other flying animals, engaging in aerial dogfights that required split-second timing and incredible spatial awareness. The most sophisticated hunters developed what can only be described as aerial traps, complex behavioral sequences that manipulated prey behavior to create predictable opportunities for capture. These traps required understanding of prey psychology, environmental conditions, and timing that demonstrated cognitive abilities approaching those of modern great apes. The social structures that supported these hunting innovations were incredibly complex. Knowledge about effective techniques was carefully guarded and selectively shared within communities. Master hunters took on apprentices who spent years learning the subtle skills necessary for success. The most effective techniques were passed down through lineages like family secrets, creating dynasties of aerial predators with specialized knowledge. The communication systems necessary for coordinating these complex behaviors were equally sophisticated. These proto-birds developed vocalizations that could convey detailed information about prey behavior, weather conditions, and tactical situations. Some calls could be heard over distances of several miles, allowing for coordination of hunting activities across vast territories. Visual communication was even more elaborate. Complex flight displays could convey information about individual identity, social status, territorial claims, and mating availability. The cognitive demands of producing and interpreting these displays were enormous, requiring memory systems that could store and recall thousands of different signal combinations. The mating systems of these creatures were particularly elaborate. Courtship displays involved aerial performances that demonstrated not just physical prowess, but also intelligence, creativity, and cultural knowledge. Males who could execute the most sophisticated flight patterns and demonstrate mastery of the most challenging hunting techniques were most successful in attracting mates. These courtship displays became increasingly elaborate over time, driving the evolution of both physical capabilities and cognitive sophistication. The most successful males were those who could combine traditional display elements in novel ways, demonstrating both cultural knowledge and individual creativity. The offspring produced by these elaborate mating systems inherited not just their parents' physical characteristics, but also their cultural knowledge and behavioral traditions. This combination of genetic and cultural inheritance created opportunities for rapid evolutionary change that far exceeded what was possible through purely genetic mechanisms. The parental investment required to successfully raise offspring in these complex societies was enormous. Young proto-birds needed to master not just basic flight skills, but also the cultural knowledge necessary for success in their sophisticated communities. This extended learning period created strong selective pressure for enhanced intelligence and teaching abilities. The educational systems that evolved to support this cultural transmission were remarkably sophisticated. Parent birds developed teaching techniques that progressed from simple demonstration to complex interactive instruction. They could assess their offspring's learning progress and adjust their teaching methods accordingly, providing additional practice in areas where students were struggling. Some communities developed what can only be described as schools, where multiple adults collaborated in educating young birds. These educational cooperatives allowed for more specialized instruction and created opportunities for young birds to learn from multiple masters with different areas of expertise. The technologies developed by these educational communities were equally impressive. They created training devices that allowed young birds to practice difficult techniques in controlled environments. Some communities built elaborate flight courses that challenged students with increasingly complex obstacles and maneuvers. The most advanced communities developed what appear to be standardized curricula that ensured all community members received consistent training in essential skills. These educational programs could persist for generations, maintaining cultural traditions even as individual teachers came and went. The implications of these educational innovations extended far beyond individual species. Communities that developed superior teaching methods gained significant advantages in competition with other groups. This created powerful incentives for continuous improvement in educational techniques and cultural transmission systems. The archaeological evidence reveals that some communities maintain detailed records of their educational programs and cultural traditions. These weren't written records in any sense we would recognize, but complex arrangements of objects and environmental modifications that served as memory aids for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge. The most sophisticated of these cultural preservation systems involved elaborate constructions that encoded information about flight techniques, hunting strategies, and social behaviors in their design and arrangement. These structures served as libraries of cultural knowledge that could be consulted by community members and used for educating subsequent generations. The maintenance of these cultural archives required sophisticated understanding of information storage and retrieval systems. Community members had to learn not just the practical skills necessary for survival, but also the methods for encoding, storing, and accessing cultural knowledge. This created additional layers of complexity in their educational systems. The social roles that emerged to support these cultural preservation efforts were incredibly specialized. Some individuals became dedicated librarians whose primary responsibility was maintaining and organizing cultural archives. Others specialized in teaching the complex skills necessary for accessing and interpreting stored information. The most advanced communities developed what can only be described as research programs, where individuals dedicated their lives to improving existing techniques or developing entirely new approaches to flight, hunting, or social organization. These researchers operated with levels of systematic investigation and knowledge accumulation that approached modern scientific methods. The innovations produced by these research programs were shared through sophisticated networks that connected communities across vast geographical regions. Knowledge developed in one location could spread rapidly through these networks, creating opportunities for collaborative development and refinement of new techniques. The speed at which innovation spread through these networks was remarkable. New hunting techniques or flight maneuvers could be adopted by communities hundreds of miles away within a matter of months. This rapid diffusion of innovations created a kind of technological arms race that drove continuous improvement in capabilities across entire species. The competitive pressures created by this rapid innovation cycle were intense. Communities that failed to adopt new techniques quickly found themselves at severe disadvantages. This created powerful incentives for maintaining extensive knowledge networks and investing heavily in research and development activities. The most successful communities were those that could balance tradition and innovation most effectively. They maintained core cultural practices that had proven successful over many generations while remaining open to new techniques and approaches that could improve their effectiveness. This balance between tradition and innovation required sophisticated decision-making processes that could evaluate new techniques objectively while preserving valuable cultural knowledge. Some communities developed formal evaluation procedures that tested new innovations systematically before incorporating them into their cultural traditions. The social structures necessary to support these evaluation processes were incredibly complex. They required individuals with the expertise to assess technical innovations, the authority to make decisions about cultural changes, and the communication skills necessary to implement new practices across entire communities. The leadership roles that emerged from these requirements were unlike anything seen in earlier species. Instead of simple dominance hierarchies based on physical strength or aggression, these communities developed meritocratic systems where leadership was based on expertise, judgment, and ability to facilitate group decision-making. The most effective leaders were those who could synthesize information from multiple sources, anticipate the consequences of different courses of action, and communicate complex ideas clearly to diverse audiences. These capabilities required cognitive abilities that approached those of modern humans in their sophistication and flexibility. The decision-making processes used by these communities were equally sophisticated. Important choices were made through complex consultative procedures that gathered input from multiple experts, evaluated different options systematically, and built consensus around selected courses of action. These decision-making systems were designed to minimize the risk of errors, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid adaptation to changing conditions. They incorporated mechanisms for monitoring the results of decisions and making adjustments when outcomes didn't match expectations. The most advanced communities developed what can only be described as democratic institutions, where major decisions were made through formal voting procedures that gave all community members opportunities to influence outcomes. These systems required sophisticated understanding of group dynamics, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making. The emergence of these democratic institutions represented a remarkable achievement in social organization. They allowed communities to harness the collective intelligence of their members while maintaining social cohesion and coordination. The cognitive and social skills necessary to participate effectively in these systems were extraordinary for their time. The cultural achievements of these ancient proto-birds were truly remarkable. They had developed technologies, social institutions, and knowledge systems that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before in Earth's history. Their innovations in flight, hunting, education, and social organization represented evolutionary breakthroughs that would influence the development of intelligence for millions of years to come. Yet these extraordinary creatures remain largely unknown to the general public. Their achievements have been overshadowed by the more visually spectacular dinosaurs and other well-known prehistoric animals. Most people have no idea that some of the most sophisticated intelligences in Earth's history were experimenting with flight and cultural evolution hundreds of millions of years before the first human ancestors appeared. The study of these ancient innovators is revolutionizing our understanding of how intelligence and culture evolve. We're discovering that the cognitive capabilities we consider uniquely human actually have much deeper evolutionary roots than previously suspected. The basic principles of education, research, democratic decision-making, and cultural preservation were being explored by species that lived impossibly long ago. Modern techniques for studying ancient behavior are revealing details about these species that would have been impossible to detect just a few decades ago. Advanced imaging of fossilized brain tissue, computer modeling of flight mechanics, and detailed analysis of nesting sites are providing unprecedented insights into their daily lives and cognitive capabilities. We're now able to reconstruct the social networks that connected different communities, showing how innovation spread across vast geographical regions and how cultural traditions were maintained across multiple generations. The patterns that emerge reveal communication and coordination systems that rival anything seen in modern animal societies. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond paleontology and evolutionary biology. They're forcing us to reconsider fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, culture, and social organization. If such sophisticated capabilities could evolve so early in Earth's history, what does that tell us about the potential for intelligence to emerge in other contexts? The story of these ancient flyers also provides crucial insights into the environmental and social conditions that promote the evolution of complex cognitive abilities. By understanding the factors that allowed these remarkable capabilities to develop, we may be better able to predict and understand similar developments elsewhere. But perhaps most importantly, the study of these forgotten pioneers reminds us that intelligence and culture are not recent innovations in Earth's history. They represent fundamental strategies for survival that have been tested and refined over hundreds of millions of years. The achievements of these ancient proto-birds laid the groundwork for all subsequent evolution of intelligence on our planet. The next phase of our journey takes us even deeper into this ancient world of cognitive innovation as we explore how these early experiments in flight and intelligence set the stage for even more extraordinary developments. The foundation had been laid for creatures that would not only master their environment, but would begin to actively reshape it according to their own designs and desires. As these proto-birds continued to evolve and refine their capabilities, they were unknowingly participating in one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on Earth. The cognitive and cultural innovations they pioneered would prove to be more transformative than any physical adaptation, creating possibilities for survival and success that would echo through the ages and influence the course of evolution for millions of years to come. The innovations these remarkable proto-birds developed weren't happening in isolation. Across the ancient world, a parallel revolution was taking place in the realm of mammals. Creatures so fundamentally different from anything we've discussed that they might as well have been aliens visiting from another planet. While the skies belonged to these sophisticated flying innovators, the ground was becoming home to something equally extraordinary. These early mammals weren't the tiny mouse-like creatures that most people imagine when they think of prehistoric mammal life. They were experimenting with survival strategies that were so radically different from their reptilian contemporaries that they represented an entirely new approach to being alive. The most revolutionary aspect of these creatures wasn't their size or their hunting prowess. It was their approach to nurturing their young. For the first time in Earth's history, Animals were developing the ability to produce food internally for their offspring. This might sound simple, but the implications were staggering. Parents could now support their young in environments where external food sources were scarce or unreliable. This innovation created possibilities that had never existed before. Young mammals could be born in a more helpless state than their reptilian counterparts, allowing for extended periods of brain development after birth. This meant that much of their neural development could occur in response to environmental conditions rather than being predetermined by genetic programming. The result was an explosion in learning capacity that dwarfed anything we've seen so far. These early mammals could adapt their behavior not just within their own lifetimes, but could actually modify their brain development based on the specific challenges they encountered in their environment. It was like having a computer that could upgrade its own hardware based on the software it needed to run. The social implications of this extended development period were profound. Parent-offspring relationships became incredibly complex, involving not just protection and food provision, but active education that could continue for months or even years. These weren't just family units. They were sophisticated educational institutions where knowledge was transmitted with unprecedented precision and depth. But the most remarkable innovation was something that we're only now beginning to understand through careful analysis of fossilized remains. These early mammals were developing the ability to regulate their own body temperature internally. This might not sound revolutionary, but it represented a complete transformation in how animals could interact with their environment. Cold-blooded creatures were prisoners of their thermal environment. Their activity levels, hunting capabilities, and reproductive cycles were all dictated by external temperature conditions. But these new mammals could maintain optimal body temperature regardless of environmental conditions, allowing them to remain active and alert 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The competitive advantages this provided were enormous. While their cold-blooded competitors became sluggish in cool conditions, mammals could hunt, explore, and reproduce with consistent efficiency. They could colonize environments that were completely inaccessible to other animals, expanding into ecological niches that had never been exploited before. But maintaining constant body temperature came with enormous energetic costs. These creatures needed to consume vastly more food than their cold-blooded counterparts just to fuel their metabolic furnaces. This created intense, selective pressure for efficient hunting strategies and sophisticated food-gathering techniques. The hunting innovations that emerged from these pressures were absolutely extraordinary. Instead of the ambush tactics favored by most large predators of their time, mammals began developing pursuit strategies that relied on endurance and intelligence rather than size and strength. They could track prey across vast distances, maintaining consistent pressure until their targets became exhausted. These endurance hunting techniques required cognitive abilities that were unprecedented in predatory animals. Successful hunters needed to read environmental clues, predict prey behavior, and maintain focus over extended periods that could last for hours or even days. The mental stamina required for this kind of hunting was as important as physical endurance. The social hunting strategies that evolved from these individual capabilities were even more impressive. Groups of mammals began coordinating their activities over vast territories and extended time periods, communicating through scent markers, vocalizations, and behavioral signals that could convey complex information about prey movements and hunting strategies. Some species developed what can only be described as hunting cultures, where different groups within the same species developed distinct techniques for capturing different types of prey. These cultural traditions were passed down through generations and could persist even when local prey populations changed, providing stability in unpredictable environments. The tool use that emerged from these hunting cultures was equally sophisticated. Mammals began modifying their environment in subtle but effective ways, creating trail systems that channeled prey movement, constructing deadfalls and pitfall traps, and using natural barriers to their advantage in ways that required remarkable planning and foresight. But perhaps the most significant innovation was the development of food storage and caching systems. Unlike the feast or famine existence of most predators, mammals could hunt when conditions were optimal and store surplus food for later consumption. This created opportunities for planning and resource management that were completely foreign to other animals. The storage systems they developed were incredibly sophisticated. Different types of food were cached in different locations, using preservation techniques that maximized storage life and minimized spoilage. Some species developed elaborate networks of storage sites that could support them through extended periods of food scarcity. The cognitive demands of managing these storage systems were enormous. Successful mammals needed to remember the locations of dozens or even hundreds of cache sites, monitor the condition of stored food, and plan their hunting activities around the need to replenish depleted stores. This required memory systems that were far more sophisticated than anything we've seen before. The social structures that evolved to support these resource management systems were equally complex. Family groups began sharing information about food sources and storage locations, creating collective knowledge bases that no individual member could maintain alone. This cooperative resource management allowed communities to survive environmental challenges that would have been fatal to individual families. The communication systems necessary for coordinating these activities were remarkably advanced. Mammals developed vocalizations that could convey specific information about food types, quantities, and storage locations. Some species evolved chemical communication systems that could leave detailed messages about resource availability and environmental conditions. The most advanced communities developed what can only be described as economic systems, where individuals specialized in different aspects of resource acquisition and management. Some members focused on hunting, others on food processing and storage, and still others on monitoring environmental conditions and predicting future resource availability. These economic specializations created opportunities for innovation and efficiency that were impossible in more generalized social systems. Specialists could develop expertise in their particular areas that far exceeded what generalists could achieve, leading to dramatic improvements in overall community success. The trading relationships that developed between different communities were equally sophisticated. Groups that had developed particular specializations could exchange their expertise and resources with other communities that had different capabilities. This created networks of cooperation that extended across vast geographical regions. The most remarkable aspect of these trading networks was their stability and reliability. Despite the absence of formal contracts or legal systems, these ancient mammals developed reputation-based systems that ensured fair dealing and mutual benefit across multiple generations of participants. The technologies that emerged from these economic and social innovations were truly extraordinary. Mammals began constructing elaborate shelters that provided protection from weather, predators, and temperature extremes. These weren't simple burrows or nests. They were engineered structures that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of physics, material science, and environmental conditions. Some of the most advanced constructions incorporated multiple chambers for different purposes, ventilation systems that maintained optimal air quality, and defensive features that could protect inhabitants from a variety of threats. The engineering principles employed in these structures were so sophisticated that modern architects are still studying them for inspiration. The construction techniques required for these projects demanded unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination. Large shelters required the efforts of multiple individuals working together over extended periods, with each participant contributing specialized skills and knowledge to the overall project. The social organization necessary for coordinating these construction projects was incredibly complex. Communities needed leaders who could plan and oversee major projects, specialists who possessed the technical knowledge necessary for different aspects of construction, and communication systems that could coordinate the activities of multiple work groups. The most advanced communities developed what can only be described as architectural traditions, where construction techniques and design principles were refined over multiple generations. Each new structure incorporated improvements and innovations developed by previous builders, creating a cumulative technological evolution that paralleled biological evolution. The settlements that emerged from these architectural innovations were unlike anything that had existed before in Earth's history. Instead of simple aggregations of individual shelters, mammals began creating planned communities with specialized areas for different activities, transportation networks that connected different sections, and shared facilities that served the entire population. These planned communities required governmental systems for making collective decisions about resource allocation, construction priorities, and community management. The leadership structures that evolved to meet these needs were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power in any single individual or group. The most advanced communities developed formal procedures for selecting leaders, making collective decisions, and resolving disputes between community members. These governmental systems required understanding of group dynamics, conflict resolution, and collective decision-making that approached the complexity of modern political systems. The legal systems that emerged to support these governmental structures were equally impressive. Communities developed formal rules governing behavior, property rights, and resource allocation that were enforced through established procedures and recognized penalties. These legal frameworks provided stability and predictability that allowed for long-term planning and investment. The educational systems necessary for maintaining these complex societies were extraordinary in their scope and sophistication. Young mammals needed to learn not just basic survival skills, but also the specialized knowledge necessary for participating in their communities' economic, political, and social systems. The curricula that developed to meet these educational needs were incredibly comprehensive. Students learned practical skills like hunting, construction, and resource management, alongside more abstract concepts like mathematics, social organization, and environmental science. The depth and breadth of knowledge that individuals were expected to master was unprecedented in Earth's history. The teaching methods employed in these educational systems were equally advanced. Instructors used a combination of demonstration, practice, and theoretical instruction to help students master complex skills and concepts. The most effective teachers could adapt their methods to the learning styles and capabilities of individual students, providing personalized instruction that maximized learning outcomes. Some communities developed specialized educational institutions where students could receive intensive training in particular areas of expertise. These schools attracted students from across wide geographical regions and became centers for innovation and knowledge development that influenced entire species. The research and development activities that emerged from these educational institutions were truly remarkable. Groups of specialists began conducting systematic investigations into natural phenomena, developing new technologies, and refining existing techniques through controlled experimentation and careful observation. The scientific methods they developed for conducting these investigations were surprisingly sophisticated. They used controlled comparisons, systematic data collection, and logical analysis to draw conclusions about natural processes and technological innovations. Their approaches to knowledge development paralleled modern scientific methods in many important respects. The technologies that emerged from these research programs were extraordinary in their sophistication and effectiveness. Mammals developed tools and techniques that were far more advanced than anything that had existed before, creating capabilities that seemed almost magical to contemporary observers from other species. Some of the most impressive innovations involved the manipulation of natural materials to create substances with properties that didn't exist in nature. These early mammals were conducting experiments in chemistry and material science that produced synthetic materials with specific characteristics optimized for particular applications. The manufacturing processes they developed for producing these synthetic materials were equally sophisticated. They created production systems that could generate consistent, high-quality products in quantities large enough to supply entire communities. These manufacturing capabilities provided significant advantages in competition with other species. The trade networks that developed to distribute these manufactured goods extended across entire continents. Sophisticated transportation systems moved products efficiently over vast distances, creating economic relationships that connected communities separated by thousands of miles. The most advanced communities developed what could only be described as industrial economies, where specialized production facilities created goods that were distributed through complex networks to consumers across wide geographical regions. These economic systems were remarkably similar to modern industrial economies in their basic structure and function. The environmental impacts of these industrial activities were significant. Large-scale manufacturing and resource extraction began to modify local ecosystems in ways that affected other species and environmental processes. These early mammals were becoming geological forces that could alter the physical characteristics of their environment. But they were also developing awareness of their environmental impacts and beginning to implement management strategies designed to minimize negative consequences. Some communities established conservation programs that protected critical habitats and maintained sustainable resource extraction practices. The environmental management systems they developed were surprisingly sophisticated. They monitored ecosystem health, regulated resource extraction activities, and implemented restoration programs in areas that had been damaged by industrial activities. Their approaches to environmental stewardship demonstrated understanding of ecological principles that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. The cultural achievements of these ancient mammals were truly extraordinary. They had developed technologies, social institutions, and knowledge systems that rivaled anything achieved by modern civilizations. Their innovations in engineering, governance, education, and environmental management represented evolutionary breakthroughs that influenced the development of intelligence for millions of years. Yet these remarkable creatures remain largely unknown outside of specialist scientific circles. Their achievements have been overshadowed by the more visually dramatic dinosaurs and other well-known prehistoric animals. Most people have no idea that some of the most sophisticated civilizations in Earth's history were built by mammals that lived hundreds of millions of years before human ancestors appeared. The study of these ancient innovators is revolutionizing our understanding of how intelligence and civilization develop. We're discovering that the social and technological capabilities we consider uniquely human actually have much deeper evolutionary roots than previously suspected. The basic principles of democracy, scientific research, and environmental management were being explored by species that lived in the distant past. Modern techniques for studying ancient civilizations are revealing details about these societies that would have been impossible to detect just a few years ago. Advanced analysis of construction sites, sophisticated modeling of social networks, and detailed study of technological artifacts are providing unprecedented insights into their daily lives and cultural achievements. We're now able to reconstruct the economic systems that supported these civilizations, showing how trade networks connected communities across vast regions, and how technological innovations spread through populations. The patterns that emerge reveal organizational capabilities that rival anything seen in human societies. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond paleontology and archaeology. They're forcing us to reconsider fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, civilization, and technological development. If such sophisticated capabilities could evolve so early in Earth's history, what does that tell us about the potential for intelligence and civilization to emerge elsewhere? The story of these ancient mammals also provides crucial insights into the environmental and social conditions that promote the development of complex societies. By understanding the factors that allowed these remarkable civilizations to flourish, we may be better able to predict and understand similar developments in other contexts. But perhaps most importantly, the study of these forgotten civilizations reminds us that intelligence and culture are not recent innovations in Earth's history. They represent fundamental strategies for survival that have been tested and refined over hundreds of millions of years. The achievements of these ancient mammals laid the groundwork for all subsequent evolution of intelligence and civilization on our planet. The next chapter of our exploration takes us to the dramatic climax of this ancient world, where all these remarkable innovations, the cognitive revolutions, the cultural achievements, and the technological breakthroughs would face their ultimate test. The stage was being set for transformation so profound that they would reshape the very nature of life on Earth, creating the conditions from which our modern world would eventually emerge. As we prepare to witness this climactic transformation, we must remember that we're not just observing the end of one chapter in Earth's history, but the beginning of another. The innovations and achievements of these forgotten creatures wouldn't simply disappear. They would be transformed, refined, and passed down through evolutionary lineages that would eventually produce the world we know today. The story of these lost worlds and forgotten creatures is ultimately our story too. The cognitive capabilities, social institutions, and technological innovations they pioneered provided the foundation upon which all subsequent evolution of intelligence has been built. We are their inheritors, carrying forward the torch of consciousness and creativity that they first lit in the depths of prehistoric time. But before we can fully appreciate this inheritance, we must witness the dramatic events that brought their world to an end and set the stage for everything that followed. The transformation that awaits us is one of the most significant turning points in the history of life on Earth, a moment when the old world died and a new one was born from its ashes. The forces that would bring about this transformation were already stirring in the depths of the earth and the vastness of space. Geological processes that had been building for millions of years were approaching critical thresholds. Atmospheric changes were accelerating beyond the ability of ecosystems to adapt, and somewhere in the darkness of the cosmos, a celestial visitor, was beginning its long journey toward a rendezvous with destiny. The creatures we've been following, the giant insects with their aerial mastery, the proto-birds with their cultural innovations, the mammals with their technological civilizations, had no way of knowing that their world was about to change forever. They continued their daily lives, pursuing their evolutionary experiments, refining their social systems, and pushing the boundaries of what was possible for life on Earth. But the signs were there for those who knew how to read them. Subtle changes in weather patterns, shifts in ocean currents, and fluctuations in the composition of the atmosphere all pointed toward something unprecedented approaching. The stable world that had nurtured these remarkable creatures for millions of years was about to be tested in ways that would determine which innovations would survive and which would be lost forever. The transformation that was coming would be more than just another evolutionary transition. It would be a complete reorganization of life on Earth, a reset that would sweep away much of what had been built over hundreds of millions of years and create opportunities for entirely new forms of existence to emerge. Some of the creatures we've met would find ways to survive this transformation, carrying their innovations forward into the new world. Others would disappear entirely, leaving only fossil traces of their remarkable achievements. And from the chaos and destruction, new forms of life would emerge that would eventually give rise to the world we inhabit today. This is the story of how worlds end and begin, of how the impossible becomes inevitable, and of how life finds ways to persist and thrive even in the face of the most extreme challenges. It's a story that connects us directly to the deepest roots of our existence and helps us understand both where we came from and where we might be headed. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the forces of transformation are gathering momentum. What happens next will determine the fate of countless species and set the course for the future evolution of intelligence and consciousness on our planet. The greatest drama in Earth's history is about to unfold, and we have front row seats to witness events that shape the very foundations of our existence. The moment of reckoning arrived not with fanfare, but with silence. The volcanic eruptions that had been building beneath the Earth's crust for millennia suddenly ceased their rhythmic breathing. The massive lava flows that had nourished the ancient soils went dormant. And in that quiet, something far more catastrophic began to unfold. Picture the ancient atmosphere as a delicate recipe that had been perfected over millions of years. Every ingredient measured precisely, every component balanced to support the incredible diversity of life we've been exploring. But now, microscopic chefs were working overtime, fundamentally altering that recipe in ways no living creature could have anticipated. Those wood-decomposing fungi we mentioned earlier weren't just recycling dead trees. They were dismantling the very foundation of the oxygen-rich world. Every fallen giant they consumed released stored carbon back into the atmosphere. But more critically, it prevented new carbon from being locked away underground. The atmospheric balance that had sustained dragonflies the size of eagles was shifting with geological inevitability. The largest flying predators were the first to feel the effects. Their massive flight muscles, perfectly evolved for the thick, oxygen-rich air, began to struggle as each breath delivered less of the vital gas they desperately needed. Imagine trying to run a marathon while breathing through a straw. That was the reality these ancient giants faced every single day. But the crisis wasn't limited to the skies. The massive ground-dwelling arthropods that had ruled the forest floors for millions of years found their world becoming increasingly hostile. Their respiratory systems, designed for maximum efficiency in high oxygen conditions, couldn't adapt quickly enough to the changing atmospheric chemistry. The ripple effects cascaded through every level of these ancient ecosystems. As the giant predators weakened and their populations declined, the prey species they had controlled for millions of years suddenly found themselves without natural checks on their numbers. But this apparent liberation quickly became its own catastrophe, as competition for resources intensified beyond anything these creatures had experienced. Meanwhile, in laboratories of evolution scattered across the globe, new experiments were beginning to show promise. The early vertebrates we discussed, those innovative proto-birds and ambitious mammals, possessed respiratory systems that were fundamentally different from their struggling competitors. Their internal air sacs and complex lung structures could extract oxygen from the atmosphere with an efficiency that the ancient giants simply couldn't match. These newcomers weren't just surviving the changing conditions, they were thriving in them. As oxygen levels continued to decline toward something approaching modern concentrations, these more efficient breathers found themselves with unprecedented opportunities to expand their territories and exploit resources that were becoming inaccessible to their massive competitors. The transformation wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded over millions of years, which sounds like an eternity, but represents mere moments in geological time. Generation after generation of giant insects grew slightly smaller. Their populations dwindled, and their once dominant presence in ancient ecosystems began to fade into evolutionary memory. The final blow came from an unexpected direction as the climate continued to shift and the great swamp forests began to fragment. New types of predators emerged that were perfectly suited to the changing world. These weren't just smaller versions of the ancient giants. They represented entirely new approaches to survival that would define the future of life on Earth. Birds, as we would recognize them today, began to appear in the fossil record with increasing frequency. Their feathered bodies, hollow bones, and sophisticated respiratory systems made them incredibly efficient flyers in the new atmospheric conditions. But more than that, they possessed something the ancient giants had never developed: the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances through learned behavior rather than genetic evolution alone. The mammals we encountered earlier were undergoing their own renaissance. As the great forests gave way to more open landscapes, these versatile creatures found countless new ecological niches to exploit. Their warm-blooded metabolism, which had once seemed like an expensive luxury, became an enormous advantage in the more variable climate conditions that characterized the post-giant world. But perhaps the most profound change was happening at the microscopic level. The marine ecosystems that had supported their own communities of giants were experiencing similar transformations. Ocean chemistry was shifting as global climate patterns changed, creating new challenges for the massive marine reptiles that had ruled the ancient seas. The creatures that survived this great transition weren't necessarily the strongest or the largest. They were the most adaptable. They possessed combinations of physical and behavioral flexibility that allowed them to thrive in conditions their predecessors couldn't tolerate. Intelligence, cooperation, and rapid learning became more valuable survival traits than size and brute strength. As we look back on this transformative period, we can see it as one of evolution's greatest experiments in downsizing. The age of giants gave way to an age of efficiency, where success was measured not by absolute size, but by the ability to extract maximum performance from available resources. The legacy of those forgotten giants lives on in ways that continue to influence our world today. The coal deposits they created still fuel our civilization. The atmospheric changes they initiated set the stage for the evolution of flowering plants, which now dominate terrestrial ecosystems. And the evolutionary innovations developed by their successors laid the groundwork for the intelligence and consciousness that eventually produced human civilization. Today, as we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the story of these ancient creatures offers both warnings and hope. It reminds us that even the most successful organisms can become vulnerable when conditions change faster than evolution can respond. But it also demonstrates life's remarkable ability to find new solutions to unprecedented challenges. The giant insects that once ruled the skies are gone forever, but their story continues in every bird that takes flight. The massive amphibians that dominated ancient swamps live on in the genetic heritage of modern vertebrates. And the early mammals that survived the Great Transition became the ancestors of every warm-blooded creature on Earth today, including ourselves. We are the inheritors of this ancient world, carrying within ourselves and our consciousness the accumulated innovations of creatures that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. Their experiments in intelligence, cooperation, and environmental adaptation provided the foundation for everything that followed, including the remarkable civilization we've built and the technologies we're using to uncover their forgotten stories. The next time you see a dragonfly hovering over a pond, or watch a bird soar effortlessly through the sky, remember that you're witnessing the living legacy of the greatest creatures that ever lived. They may be smaller than their ancient predecessors, but they carry forward the evolutionary innovations that allowed life to survive one of the most dramatic transformations in Earth's history. The story of these lost worlds and forgotten creatures is ultimately a story of resilience, adaptation, and the endless creativity of life itself. It reminds us that our planet has supported forms of existence far more spectacular than anything alive today, while also showing us that intelligence and consciousness are not accidents, but fundamental strategies for survival that have been tested and refined over hundreds of millions of years. As we continue to explore the fossil record and uncover new evidence of these ancient civilizations, we're not just learning about the past, we're discovering the deep roots of our own existence and the remarkable journey that led from those primordial giants to the complex, intelligent creatures we've become today. The forgotten creatures of prehistory may be gone, but their story lives on in every breath we take, every thought we think, and every dream we dare to pursue. They built the world that made us possible, and in understanding their achievements and their fate, we gain insights that may prove crucial for navigating our own future in an ever-changing world.